It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pierce coming to you from Baltimore. The world is currently experiencing drought on 5 continents. 2016 continues to break global temperature records, and water wells around the world are drying up. India and large parts of Venezuela have been undergoing drought for 3 to 5 consecutive years. Part of Africa have also been hit hard. The Kenyan government announced on Wednesday that it would be shutting down refugee camps near its border with Somalia, where, according to the United Nations report, severe drought has affected nearly 1 million people, where close to 1 in 12 are unable to meet their food requirements. Tens of thousands of people have fled the country to the refugee camps in Kenya. In southern Africa, Lesotho, Malawi, Mozambique, Swaziland, and Zimbabwe are teetering on the brink and have declared droughts a national disaster. Further north in Ethiopia, where they are also in the middle of a political unrest, more than 36 million people are threatened by food insecurity. On to discuss all of this is Nemo Bassey. Nemo Bassey is a Nigerian architect, environmental activist, author, and poet. He chaired Friends of the Earth International from 2008 through 2012 and was executive director of Environment Rights Action for 2 decades. His accomplishments are so many, too many to mention here, so please do read his full bio below. Thank you so much for joining us, Nemo.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be with you today.
So, Nemo, the situation is really difficult in Zimbabwe. We've heard reports of that, but the whole Southern African region is experiencing this unusually high levels of drought, food insecurity, and of course, at the heart of it all, malnutrition of children. Give us a sense of the gravity of the problem you're dealing with, and is there a large level mobilization and a response to this?
The challenge Africa always faces with regard to global warming impacts are enormous. This is why when our policymakers and governments go to climate talks, we expect them to address the root issues as they affect us at home and not just follow what other governments or what polluting nations are doing or are unwilling to do. You will recall that at the Paris Agreement, which has been celebrated by many leaders, the preamble to the agreement said that they would try to keep global temperature increase to be about 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels or much below, well below 2 degrees Celsius. Now, all that was said without any real decisions and actions that would bring the global temperature increase to those margins, which means that Africa will continue to experience this kind of dramatic weather events, droughts, floods, because we're having one extreme to the other. The droughts are so severe right now, as you've mentioned, in places like Lesotho and Kenya, and of course, also in Nigeria, we're having serious water stress in northern Nigeria, and this has contributed to open conflict and violence because of the conflicts between pastoralists who are being displaced and farmers and others in other regions that are less stressed by these weather events. So it's a continental disaster, really, a continental emergency, which requires very close look at what we can do to defend our continent. So there's a growing movement, but these movements are generally coalescing under different settings. We have the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, which is bringing together all those who are working on climate justice issues across the continent. We also have Oil Watch Africa, which is looking at the root cause of global warming and the impacts on Africa, which is the continual dependence on fossil fuels globally.
Nnimmo, highlight for us where the crisis is the greatest, and is the response at this time adequate, or has there been any effort to shed more resources into the areas that's hardest hit?
I think the most dramatic impact we're seeing right now is in Kenya, especially with the threat and the possibility of closing down refugee camps, which would compound the refugee crisis in that part of Africa, in the Horn of Africa and that region. So to me, this is very dramatic and very dangerous move. And in that part of the continent, what happens sometimes is that rain, rather than falling on the continent, falls in the Indian Ocean. And all this is because of climate change. In Nigeria, which is where I live, you must have heard about the Boko Haram phenomenon, which has led to the deaths of thousands of Nigerians. This is a situation that is now, when the war against Boko Haram is being won by the day, but now we're having a new kind of violence caused by pastoralists who are displaced by the shrinkage of water in Lake Chad from 22,000 square kilometers in the early 1960s to less than 2,000 square kilometers today. So it's an emergency that is unfolding, even as it's very precarious at the moment.
Now, what's unusual about this level of drought we are seeing throughout the world? I mean, places like Venezuela, lush tropical climate, places like Kenya, and other parts of Africa where normally, these are green and lush areas, are now suffering the plight of drought. Now, some people have referred to the El Nino effect here. Is there a discussion about that, and is this going to be the situation we're going to face for time to come?
Well, I think the best way for me to respond to that question is that in Africa, unfortunately, many times we are taken by surprise by this phenomenon because a lot of people are just seeing the experiencing these conflicts without looking at the root causes of the problem, and this is why the response has to be more intense than it is right now. And many activists and communities who are engaged on this issue do know that this is related to El Nino and such, that sort of climate manifestations. But there are also many cases, many issues that raise special concerns for us. If you look closely at the entire climate scenario and the solutions that are being offered by rich, powerful nations, some of the suggestions are going into, global warming is mostly man-made, no matter what the deniers are saying. And we are the victims. Africans are victims. Small island states are victims. But solutions like geoengineering would pose special problems for Africa, because all the scenarios, geoengineering in terms of deflecting heat from the sun, whitening of clouds, seeding the clouds to determine where rains fall and where rains don't fall, all this would not respond equitably for everyone on the planet, because it will mean that certain people, certain investors, certain industrial sectors, and certain governments will be holding the global climate thermostat. And Africa is not does not have the clout right now to be able to compete in that dimension. And of course, I believe it will be a crime against the planet and against the people if such technologies are allowed to take root. So yes, going back to the question, what we're experiencing now, unless real action is taken to combat global warming, this is going to be compounded, unfortunately.
All right, Nnimmo, we're going to take up discussing this in a second segment. Please join me.